you like me to share?
Yeah, you could do.
If it helps, okay. Can you see the text? Is it big enough?
I think it needs to be a bit bigger.
Okay.
So who would like to begin? Who's found something in the text which is revelatory or
I don't mind beginning for a little bit, and then if someone else could take over.
good?
Okay.
Yeah.
In this paper, I'll be examining a term that has become important in contemporary discussions of painting and of visuality, le regard, the gaze. First of all, I will do what I can to trace the concept of the gaze as it passes from Sartre to Lacan, from Sartre's description of the gaze of the other in being and nothingness, to Lacan's reworking of that description in the first two sections of the four fundamental concepts of psychoanalysis. To some, this will be familiar territory. To others, it will be less familiar. I'll do my best to proceed as clearly as I can. Once the account of le regard, the gaze, is stated, I want to move to what may seem at first sight a quite unconnected account of vision, the one that emerges in the immediate meditation on Western philosophy conducted in Japan, principally by Kitaro Nishida, and then by Nishida's student, Kiji Nishitani. The reason I wish to invoke Nishida and Nishitani is that their theoretical development seems in many respects to go further than Sartre and Lacan towards a radical reformulation of our thought on visuality, and as a consequence of this, our thought on painting. My argument will be that the line of thinking that passes from Sartre to Lacan in crucial respects remains held within conceptual enclosure, where vision is still theorized from the standpoint of a subject placed at the center of a world. Although this centralized subject is progressively dismantled by Sartre and Lacan, and the direction of their thought is unmistakably towards a radical decentering of the subject, it seems to me to be areas in which the standpoint of the subject as center is actually retained. The result of this residual centering upon the standpoint of the subject is that vision is portrayed as menaced at that vestigial center, threatened from without, and in some sense persecuted in the visual domain by the regard or gaze. The direction of thought that passes from Nishida to Nishitani undertakes a much more thoroughgoing displacement of the subject in the field of vision, which finds expression in a term so far largely neglected in the Western discussion of visuality, sunyata, translated as blankness or emptiness or nihility. Nihility. The concept of blankness, as it evolves in the thought of Nishida and then of Nishitani, relocates the gaze, le regard, in an expanded field where a number of conceptual transformations become necessary and urgent, notably concerning the aspect of menace, which still colors Lacan's account of the subject's visual experience, concerning the question of where the subject resides under the gaze and in the expanded field of sunyata or blankness, and concerning, in the practice of painting, the repercussions of the structures of le regard, the gaze, and sunyata, blankness or emptiness, at the level of brush, pigment, and frame. Sartre's conception of the gaze of the other is clearest in his story of scenario of the watcher in the park. Sartre's narrative involves two stages. In its first movement, Sartre enters a park and discovers that he is alone. Everything in the park is therefore him to regard from an unchallenged center of the visual field. All of the park unfolds before this absolute center of a lived horizon. The subject resides at that still point of the turning world, master of its prospects, sovereign, surveyor of the scene. In this initial exhilaration of self-possession, nothing threatens the occupancy of the self as focus of its visual kingdom. But in Sartre's second movement, the reign of plenitude and luminous peace, is brought abruptly to an end. Into the park and into the watcher's solitary domain, there enters another, whose intrusion breaks the peace and fractures the watcher's self-enclosure. The watcher is in turn watched, observed of all observers. The viewer becomes spectacle to another's sight. Now all the lines of force which had converged on the centre of the watcher's lived horizon turn, reverse, and reconverge on the space of the intruder and his eruption. Before, all of the perspective lines had run in from the horizon towards the watcher in the park. Now another perspective opens up and the lines of flight race away from the watcher self to meet this new point of entry. For the intruder himself stands at his own centre of things and draws towards and into himself everything he sees. The watcher self is now a tangent, not a centre, a vanishing point, not a viewing point, an opacity on the other's distant horizon. Everything reconverges on this intrusive centre where the watcher self is not. The intruder becomes a kind of drain which sucks in all of the former plenitude, a black hole pulling the scene away from the watcher self into an engulfing void. Were we to represent Sartre's scenario in terms of picture, the Raphael Sposalizio would illustrate its general formation, figure 2. In one sense, all of the architectural spaces turn towards the viewer, displaying their advertent aspects to one who stands at the place of masterly overview, with every line of flight across the cornices, flagstones, and arcades travelling in towards the sovereign spectator. But, in another sense, the architecture of the piazza turns towards a place where the viewer does not and cannot exist. The moment the viewer appears and takes that position at the viewpoint, he or she comes face to face with another term that is the negative counterpart to the viewing position, the vanishing point. All of the orthogonal lines across windows, doors, pavements converge there at the vanishing point where, par excellence, the viewer is not. The lines of the piazza race away towards this drain or black hole of otherness placed at the horizon in a decentering that destroys the subject's unitary self, possession. Oh. Self-possession. The viewpoint and the vanishing point are inseparable. There is no viewpoint without vanishing point and no vanishing point without viewing point. The self-possession of the viewing subject has built into it, therefore, the principle of its own abolition. Annihilation of the subject as centre is a condition of the very moment of the look. This pictorial example is perhaps closer to Lacan than to Sartre, for in Sartre, the agent that accomplishes the reversal of the visual field is peripatetiae, is personal, another being, before whom I become opaque, abject, in a dialectic of master and slave. Lacan's reworking of Sartre's scenario dispenses with this personalized other. His story is a good deal stranger. Lacan is away from Paris, in Brittany, out with fishermen on the open sea. On the surface of the sea are pieces of flotsam, in particular a sardine can, to which one of the men reacts by saying to Lacan, "You see the can? Do you see it? Well, it doesn't see you." The remark disturbs Lacan because he can sense a perspective in which it is untrue. The world of inanimate objects, to some extent, always looks back on the perceiver. What is the source of this strangely empowered look back? Lacan's account depends not on the eruption of another personal viewer, but the eruption in the visual field of the signifier. When I look, what I see is not simply light, but intelligible form. The rays of light are caught in arrests, a network of meanings, in the same way that flotsam is caught in the net of the fishermen. The human beings collectively, to orchestrate their visual experience together, it is required that each submit his or her retinal experience to the socially agreed descriptions of an intelligible world. Vision is socialized, and thereafter deviation on this social construction of visual reality can be measured and named. variously as hallucination, misrecognition, or visual disturbance. Between the subject and the world is inserted the entire sum of discourses which make up visuality, that cultural construct and make visuality different from vision. The notion of unmediated visual experience. Between wretched and world is inserted a screen of signs, a screen consisting of all the multiple discourses on vision built into the social arena.
Stop that. That's very good. So what's happening? What's
Well, if you put this.
Should I go back first page?
Hello? Can you hear me?
yeah?
If you put this in the context of, say, I don't know, Kant and the idea of object and subject, I think this is going beyond this and kind of stripping this down. And maybe it's picking this idea that the object might look back. I guess coming from this existentialist ideas, but the object doesn't really have any intelligibility without that sort of significance or interaction, without the subject. And I guess this is kind of something. What is it? Not the Kant, the other person we're talking about. Sartre picked up on in Heidegger's writing, and Heidegger, and also the structure is picked up on. But I think this idea that the being of something only has a being in the presence of a being, in the presence of the subject being us. Kind of something about the way we envision the world. It changes radically the way we think of the world. If you stop this idea of the object having meaning without us. In Kant, the object would have some meaning without us. We kind of explore it independent as an independent object. In this perspective, that's not the way it is. The object only comes into something when we are there. There's not a world we are outside of that comes into existence when we decide to look at it. The world only exists when it's part of us. This interaction brings our life.
In a way, the text is dealing with the logic of subject-centered philosophy.
Well, I mean, in fact, Heidegger's going to Heidegger and these, in fact, I think the Japanese Kyoto school are going to completely destroy that. They're going to say that's not where it's based at all. The subject idea, subject-object is not the way it is at all. And this idea that there's a subject and the subject is isolated from something else is the wrong starting point. But if you start from there, you won't get to what's going on. I think Sartre misinterpreted what Heidegger was really saying.
Any other thoughts?
Well, Lacan brings a signifier into it. This is really, I'm making this up as I go along, just trying to think it through. And the signifier in Lacan and Freud relates to the unconscious. And so there's a psychic element in the way Lacan is interpreting or would interpret the object's ability to perceive. Well, he doesn't really say the object perceives, he says discourse intervenes, really. So I'm just flagging it that there must be some kind of psychic relation that has some relation to the unconscious and to signifiers within the unconscious. And Sartre brings in the other. And I was thinking about that in terms of Lacan and now it's a long time ago since I read all this, but the grand other and objectivity O. And I'm stopping there because I think it just needs to be worked through a lot more. And maybe the paper comes on to deal with it. I don't know because I haven't read that far. But I just think there's something about the psychic that Lacan is trying to possibly deal with at this point. The unconscious.
What do you think of the story, the Sardine Can? In his Four Fundamentals of Psychoanalysis, he mixes theoretical discourse with narrative episodes. And one of the main episodes, which is cited again and again and again, is the Sardine Can. And the Sardine Can is interesting because it's not just that the fisherman points out the sardine can in the flotsam, but there's been a death.
Yes.
And that is partly haunted by this foreknowledge, and it warps the perception. It changes the visual field. So what is something which is unrecognized and unacknowledged plays a fundamental role in the construction of the narrative. So you get a play of recognition and misrecognition within the story, which is essential to the story, that there's a misrecognition at the center of the account.
Right, and that fits totally with Lacan's understanding of misrecognition in the mirror phase. Also, the sardine can is potentially, anyway, I envisaged a shiny, reflective surface on the sardine can.
It blinks in the sun.
Right.
But isn't it also an argument for decentering from vision? So it's not just the person looking at it that's the only control of vision, that it can be looking at you.
It throws you. So before you, as it were, so-called master it, it's already thrown you.
Yes. And the blink's interesting. The idea of the blink.
How do you take the movement from Zen painting to Raphael, and then to The Ambassadors by Holbein? In fact, the Holbein painting is used on the front of most editions of the Four Fundamentals of Psychoanalysis by Lacan. Before we get to reading about it, why would they can be so fascinated by this painting?
Because I guess there's the use of, well, the sign and a distorted sign with the skull at the odd perspective.
Who remembers seeing it for the first time?
Yeah, because I think we saw it somewhere on one of our gallery visits. I can't remember where it was. Was it the National Gallery?
National Gallery.
National Gallery, yes.
You
There's
don't.
also indeterminacy involved about this distorted skull. I mean, indeterminacy.
There's an intriguing sideline to this. It was restored in the latter part of the 20th century, and there are quite a number of people think, or authorities think, that they've got it wrong. That they kind of added a perspectival view to something which was read through a glass. So it's not just a matter of finding the viewpoint. What are the clues in the painting to do with death? I presume you've all seen this painting. There's a broken lute string, isn't there? Which signifies discord. There's in the far corner on the left-hand side, there's a crucifix which looks across the field of the painting. It slowly comes undone from being a magnificent courtly painting, a dual portrait. Being a much, incredibly intricate signification of time and the relation between the arts and the sciences and the alchemy involved in the painting. So a lot of the clock face and all the scientific instruments all point to the time of Christ's death. And so you've got this, one of the figures is a Protestant, one of those is a Catholic. So it sets up the relationship between France and England and the struggle between the Catholic Church and the Protestant Church. There's a Lutheran hymn book. So it's endlessly referring to something outside of the frame. Anyway, someone else want to read?
Maybe I can read. From this screen casts a shadow. Sometimes Lacan calls it a scotoma, sometimes a stain. For when we look through the screen, what we see is caught up in a network that comes to us from the outside. Mobile tesserae of signification, a mosaic that moves. This network is greater than its individual agents or operators. When I learn to speak, I am inserted into systems of discourse that were there for I was, and will remain after I am gone. Similarly, When I learn to see socially, that is, when I begin to articulate my retinal experience with the codes of recognition that come to me from my social milieu. I am inserted into systems of visual discourse that saw the world before I did, and will go on seeing after I see no longer. The screen casts a shadow of death. Everything I see is orchestrated with a cultural production of seeing that exists independently of my life and outside it. My individual discoveries, the findings of my eye as it probes through the world, come to unfold in terms not of my making and indifferent to my mortality. The screen mortifies sight. Its terms are points of signification, chains of signifiers that of themselves have no light. The signifier operates on light and with light, but has no light of itself, or only the light it borrows from my eye. The signifier casts its shadow of darkness across my vision, and because of that darkness, I am no longer bathed in the lustre of luminous plenitude. Into my visual field something cuts across, namely the network of signifiers, to illustrate in pictorial terms what that something is. Lacan provides his example of Holbein. The ambassadors are masters of learning, in possession of all the codes of knowledge, of science and art, fashioned in their social milieu. But their visual field is cut across by something they cannot master, the skull, which casts itself sideways across their space through anamorphosis. The effect of this insertion of the screen, or skull, or scotoma, is that the subject who sees is no more the center of visual experience than the subject of language is at the center of speech. When I speak, I may try to fill each word I utter with the full meaning of my unique thought, but the fact remains that in the social arena where I speak, the words I utter have to follow paths or networks laid down before I enter their terrain. The speaker did not create this, nor does the speaker control them. In the same way, when I see, what I see is formed by paths or networks laid down in advance of my seeing. It may be the case that I feel myself to inhabit some kind of center in my speech. But what decenters me is the network of language. It may similarly be that I always feel myself to live at the center of my vision, somewhere where, behind my eyes. But again, that vision is decentered by the network of signifiers that come to me from the social milieu. Lacan pushes this description further. In place of the speaker in ordinary conversation, he invites us to consider the speech of the analysand. The experience of analysis, as Lacan defines it, forces the speaker to recognize that the words she or he utter have their own perturbing life, that they follow paths and chains unknown in advance, in movements that circle round, yet never reach the locus of desire or fear. Psychoanalysis is that experience of speaking on the field of the others. The analysand does not stand at the center of control over these motions of the signifier. He or she is more like their bewildered observer. Lacan's analysis of vision unfolds in the same terms. The viewing subject does not stand at the center of a perceptual horizon and cannot command the chains and the series of signifiers passing across the visual domain. Vision unfolds to the side of, in tangent to, the field of the other. And to that form of seeing, Lacan gives the name, seeing on the field of the other, seeing under the gaze. I want now to pass from the current of thought of Sartre and Lacan to another current, the one which passes from Europe into Japan by way of the most influential Japanese philosopher of the 20th century, Nishida, and which passes on from Nishida to the writer who, at the level of translation, is much more accessible to Western readers than Nishida himself. Keiji Nishitani. Nishitani's critique of Sartre occupies a crucial section of Nishitani's book Religion and Nothingness, and it bases itself on the observation that with Sartre there's no radical overturning of the enclosure of thought, which treats the questions of ontology of subject and object from within the standpoint of the subject. Nishitani remarks that the Sartrean je is capable of reaching a level of nihility in which everything that exists is cast into doubt, except the fundamental irreducibility of the je, which does the doubting. For example, when the je fully understands the death of God and comes to doubt the viability of an ethics imposed on the subject from the outside, the Sartrean je reacts by falling back on itself and by struggling to locate an authenticity of the self from which ethical action can emanate directly. When the forms of ethic pass into the field of nihility and are annulled there, that annihilation is overcome by the just assertion of itself as authentic core of moral agency. The passing of ethical forms into the field of annihilation dismantled them, but does not dismantle the je. The self which reacts by redoubling the force of the self as it operates on the nothingness outside it. For Nishidani, Sartre's nihilism is half-hearted. Sartre places the universe around the self on the field of nihility, yet the self gathers force there and uses the blankness surrounding it as, so to speak, a springboard from which to launch its own authentic operations. This is to treat the field of nihility, Nishitani observes, as though it were something against which the self reacts in its case by multiplying its efforts and solidifying its centeredness. What does not happen in such a work, as Nishitani sees it, is the placing of the je itself on the field of nihility or emptiness. The je re-emerges from its encounter with nihility, reinforced it in its position as the center of its experience. So it is with such a description of vision and the scenario of the watcher in the park. The instruction of the other makes of the self a spectacle or object in relation to that other. The self is threatened with annihilation by that eruption of authority on the subject's horizon. But such an analysis in fact stops a long way short of the stage at which this menace to the subject who would pass on to the field of nihility and become a full decentering of the subject. Such as watcher is objectified by the other's gaze, just as that other is objectified by his gaze. But the fundamental terms of subject and object remain intact throughout the encounter. It is as though both the watcher in the park and the intruder who disturbs its peace were supplied with optical frames, binoculars, telescopes, viewfinders, which restricted the surrounding world to just these two poles, the watcher now threatened by the other's gaze, and the intruder similarly threatened, though menaced by each other. Neither is fundamentally challenged. The subject can survive such a gaze, and survive more strongly for being exposed to its authority, which may menace the subject, but which does not in any sense actually dissolve or annihilate it. The subject's sense of being a subject is heightened, not undone, and this, following Nishitani's argument, is because the entire scenario is restricted to its twin poles of subject and object. What is not thought through is the question of vision's wider frame.
Stop there. So, any thoughts?
Yeah, this this otherness, I think Sartre's otherness is forms a grounding, or attempts to form a grounding which kind of strengthens the subject and doesn't destabilize, which is what this nihilistic point of view is. That's exactly what he misinterprets when he misreads his mistranslation of where he got all this from, which was from Heidegger. In fact, the other is that world in which we exist, which keeps telling us everything we should do, but it's completely ungrounded, and we don't realize it's completely ungrounded. But once we realize it's completely ungrounded, we are completely annihilated. There is nothing there. We just live in this world of otherness, which dominates our life, everything we think, but has no ground whatsoever. And that, I think, is very related to what's going on here. And Sartre, I think, misrepresents that. And in reacting to that, the subject, he opens the idea of subject-object, which in this understanding doesn't really exist at all. It's just an illusion, waiting to be uncovered. And when he refers to authenticity, this authenticity is the glimpse, the glimmer that this world is completely ungrounded, that we occasionally get when what is underneath, what is really going on, is revealed in the glance of the broken object, or that doesn't quite function the way one would expect it to work.
I think that's really interesting, and I'm just thinking in Lacan's, when you talked about this, our lives are dominated by this other, then I'm thinking again about Lacan's idea of the other, God or whatever it is. So in that sense, Heidegger's conception and Lacan's ideas might overlap. Yeah, sorry, there was something else I was going to say, but now I've forgotten, it's out of my head. But yeah, just thinking about the idea of the other has a parallel between Lacan and Heidegger, as you explained it. And it would seem that Sartre doesn't really go there.
Well, you know the story that Being in Time was never translated for a very long time. Was not translated, and so I think Sartre translated it himself, or read it while he was in a prisoner of war camp, way before it's been translated, and misunderstood a number of things, and he started his existentialism, described as one of the greatest mistakes, but he did misunderstand what Heidegger was getting at. So existentialism came from that. That isn't really what Heidegger was getting at, and I think that's actually very similar to what's going on in here. There were quite a few Japanese philosophers whose partly to do with Sartre and also to do with Heidegger.
Sartre was also...
Levinas was responsible for bringing Heidegger's Being in Time to the French public. Anyway. Alex.
Sartre was also very, very much influenced by a French writer, Céline, who had a horrific experience in World War I and wrote this extraordinary book called Journey to the Night, which this month has just been made into an audiobook by Naxos Audiobooks, who do great audiobooks, which has been very influential on particularly Chris Davis as well, Journey to the Night. Sartre was reading that in the late 1930s, and actually much of Nausea, Sartre's book, is kind of in the same way, Patrick, that you described some of his work as maybe a misreading of Heidegger, is you could say a misreading of Céline. And Céline was sort of describing mud as a kind of a material representative, maybe, of that other. And then Sartre kind of talks about ooze in a similar kind of vein, but preserving its materiality, which is, what then became interesting to people like Chris Davis, but, maybe forgot, one might say, the alterity of it. But, within sort of that kind of idea that there's maybe a misreading of a perception of death, whether that's both in Céline or in Heidegger. I was sort of, when we first listened to the anecdote, if that's the right word, of the scenario in the park, of walking into a park and feeling that it's your plane of view and your kind of area of control, and then someone else walks into the park, and that completely changes the sort of perspectives and lines of sort of sight and visuality. I was sort of thinking to myself, within the context of the idea of menace, what if you walk into a park and you think you're the only one there and you're sort of looking around, and then suddenly you realise that actually someone's there, maybe under a tree in the corner of the park, and they're looking at you. And that would be a very different kind of set of feelings that you'd have to either walking into an empty park or to someone else walking into the park that you're in. And that sort of that sort of train of thought, I suppose, I was kind of thinking in that lines, was then kind of, I suppose, accentuated by this kind of discussion of survival that we've kind of has just been introduced in this kind of the recent section that we've been reading. And Wittgenstein, who I've been spending a lot of time with over the last couple of years, so forgive me, has this a couple of interesting lines in his Tractatus book that he wrote during the First World War, while he was in the trenches, while he was kind of under fire. And one of it's not about that experience in many ways. It's about logic and language and the limits of what's communicable. But at one point he says, the limit of the field of vision does not allow the eye to partake of it. I.e., we can't perceive our own perceiving self. And he then, later on, says, death is not an event of life. Death is not lived through. And it is also presenting another sort of limit there. But I really feel that in his sort of ideas of visual limits and
I'm at home.
You're home now.
Yeah.
What happened? Did something happen? You were in the hospital?
Yeah, I don't know. I've not been sleeping, and I can't stand up in the night. I get my body weakens. So
Jonathan, just to let you know, you're talking in case you want this is private for
I
you.
can't actually stand up.
Just at night?
It's at night mainly.
Yeah. I guess that's when you're be strong and you're sort of...
Jonathan? Jonathan?
How was it in the day?
Jonathan?
It's less pronounced,
Jonathan?
but I wake up about 10 times.
I think we could all just turn the volume down or something and not listen.
Yeah, should we all,
Okay.
we could all leave the room. For
Yeah.
It's
Should we leave?
like a real hall in the night.
I'm going to leave.
It's sort of
And Jonathan, if you need, just shout to our group chat. And any of us, if we are available, we can just go to your place.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Jonathan, are you okay to resume or do you want to call it quits?
We can just pick it up again next week.
Yeah, do you want to take a rest today or
I'm fine.
you're fine?
You sure?
Let's get some substance completed.
Okay.
Then keep reading. Do I keep reading or change to another person?
Change.
Okay, shall I have a go? Like status, being and nothingness, Nishtani's religion and nothingness set out to criticize the Cartesian, the self-enclosure of the cogito. In the cogito, the subject conceives of the self as the universe center, surrounded by the stable plenitude of an object world. Both subject and object exist in the state of the mutual conformation. Sorry, let me just zoom in a little bit. I can't really see it. And fixity, The subject from its position of the center amidst the world of the things looks out on its objects and perceives them as separate entities. That is, objects manifest to the subject as a complete beings having the stable location in the single place. Independent self-existence requiring the existence of nothing else in order to exist. Permanent or enduring from the subject looking out upon the world of entity that found itself to be an entity, symmetrical with them, like them, the subject exists in one place and one place only. It exists independently of the object around it, whose existence the subject is free to adopt, without that doubt entailing that is a subject come to doubt its own existence, and the subject remains itself despite transformation in the material world. In addition to those qualities of entity which the subject shares with its object world, the subject of cogito has the further characteristic which the objects of the worlds do not share, are possession of universe, the universal center around which object words clutters or converges as a subject's experimental horizon, like Sartre and like Lacan. The Nishitanis aim to dismantle this anthropocentric subject, but his critic differs from theirs in his insistence on the term sunyata, translated as emptiness, a radical impermanence, the blankness, and nihility, the entity as a conceptual, the entity as a conceptual category is found unable to withstand the critique of Sunyata, the transposed to the field of Sunyata, both the subject entity and the object entity literally broke up. The stabilizing the entity as a fixed form with the bounded outline is possible only if the universal surrounding the entity is screamed out, an entity withdrawn from the universal field of the transformation. The concept of entity can be preserved only by the optical that casts around each entity a perceptual frame that makes a card from the field that is immobilize the card within the static frame, but as soon as that frame is withdrawn, the object is found to exist as a part of a mobile continuum that cannot be caught anywhere. If the object is, say, a flower, its existence is only as a phase of incremental transformations between the seeds and dust, in a continuous exploration of the perturbation of the matter. At no point does the object come under an arrest that is what immobilize it as a form, and adults moved on to the fields of the Sunyata or radical impermanency. The entity comes apart. It cannot be said to occupy a single location, since its lotus locus is always the universal field of the transformations. It cannot achieve a separation from that field or acquire any kind of bounded outline because its separability from the field of impermanency is cannot be said to enjoy independent self-existence, since the ground of a being is the existence of everything else, and it cannot present it in the guise of the enduring form. In Sutani's description, an object present can be defined only in negative terms, since there's no way of the singling out of objects without at the same time including it in the global field of transformations that appears as objects. X is only the difference between the X and the total surrounding field. Similarly, that appears as the surrounding field is only its difference from the object X. Nishitani's thinking is morphologically close to the Saussures account of the location of the individual word in the language. The word the Saussure maintains is nothing in itself. It lacks all the properties of the entity. Rather, the word is constitutes the diacritically in its different from its surrounding field, in this case, all the other words in the language. In the same way, Nishitani argues for the diacritical existence of objects. The system of objects knows no positive terms. Moreover, since the object field is continuous mobility, individual objects are constituted by difference differ in time, as well as Nishitani's thinking here is close to Derrida's portrayal of the difference in language. The meaning of the word never stands worse in the full array. If we want to know the meaning of an individual word and look it up in the dictionary, what dictionary gives is not the meaning of the word, but another word's synonym. As one reads a sentence, one does not know what a word in the middle sentence means until the one reaches the end of the sentence. And that sentence in turn changes as one moves to the next sentence or paragraph or page. Meaning in a sense never arrives, and in the same way to Nishitani, being that never arrives, beings never arrive.
Just stop there.
Okay.
So this idea of meaning never arrives. I was just thinking, Karen, what's diacritical mean? Are you there, Karen?
You're asking what for a definition of diacritical. An exchange. So something similar to the idea of perspective in Renaissance that we read about earlier, about or being looked at and looking at the same time. So there's a meaning that's arrived at in a kind of a dialogue, if you're using the word diacritical. Is that what you're looking for?
Yeah.
Um,
Words can slip by without ever being defined.
It's and it's really interesting to hear this relationship between these different movements, ways of thinking, where they're connecting.
I mean, listening to what you just read, it's so aligned to Heidegger's thought. I think it's almost like reading Heidegger. Then again, Heidegger is very well renowned in Japan. And I also read recently, though I haven't verified it, many of his texts are actually almost copied from parts of Buddhist writing, which isn't unheard of because there were other texts he wrote in Being and Time, which are just straight out of, for example, Kierkegaard. Right.
I agree with you. I mean, when you were reading it all, I was thinking, oh gosh, this does sound very similar to Buddhist thinking. I don't know much about Kierkegaard. Has he got a relation to Buddhist thinking, or is it?
Kierkegaard is really more to do, well, this relationship to I mean, he's usually, this relationship to death and antagonism comes from, stems originally from Kierkegaard in relation to existentialism, though he's not an existentialist. And it's Heidegger gets it from Kierkegaard.
Do you think Heidegger, well, I mean, I was going to say what came first, Heidegger or Buddhism? Obviously Buddhism did, but do you think...
Well, I mean, Heidegger, just to be clear, Heidegger he does exactly the same and tries to dismantle Cartesians. And he argues that you have to go all the way back to Aristotle to find anything constructive, and everything has been missed the point and gone off the rails, and he's trying to put them back on the rails, and that's why he's always going back to early Greek thought, because he believes they missed the point. They will never get to the essence of being the way they overlook this point completely by the very start, from the very beginning. Because exactly what is being said here. This entity itself, if you study the entity and you isolate yourself from the entity, and this idea of theorizing about the entity has absolutely zero to the being of the entity. It's not even tackling the problem, and yet all of philosophy for 1,000 years, according to him, 2,000 years, spent their time doing that, and only back at the origins of philosophy did they not do that, and that never happened in Buddhism. That's why he picks up on why you can find things in that are much more that pure idea of nihilism or whatever. This finding of being, of what existence is exactly what Buddhism and this impermanence idea is all about. They never got sidetracked by the scientific endeavor or whatever. That's basically what he's saying. Why he would quote, and I guess that's why you would pick on Nietzsche and Kierkegaard, because these are outliers who try to unravel philosophy and said that it's going nowhere.
Right. And when you just mentioned the science there, I was thinking about sort of quantum and vibration and our relation to the cosmic energy. So in some senses, I don't know, perhaps your understanding of physics might also have a...
Yeah, I mean, I think you can, but in this idea that is also expressed in this text by this Japanese, that there is no separability, that everything is entangled and there is no subject-object, there is no... As soon as you try and theorize, as the Cartesians do, and separate yourself from the object, you've already missed the point. You have to be in the hermeneutic circle, as Heidegger would say. There is no way out of that. There is no way out of being in this circle. You cannot separate yourself from it. And of course, that fits in exactly with quantum physics and field theory, and that's why there have been people connecting Buddhism to science. And I'm not... Anyway, yeah.
Patrick,
So,
Karen, please.
I just wondered, since we're talking about Heidegger, how does the event or eventuation work into this way of understanding objects? Because the
What was the
event
word,
is
sorry?
a
What was
creative.
that? How does the what? What did you say? Sorry, I didn't catch it.
The event.
The event.
Yeah.
I think the event for Heidegger would be this. I don't know. I did actually pick this up somewhere recently, and I'm pretty sure it was the way I was thinking of it was along the lines of this point where you get a glimpse of what's underneath the surface.
I was thinking.
Yeah, go on. Sorry.
I was thinking of it as a creative act, like
Yeah.
but
I think that's something Deleuze picks up and goes with, because
okay.
I mean, it's also very noticeable that no one ever mentions Heidegger, because they mention Derrida, and Derrida's thought is coming from is highly connected to Heidegger, but no one mentions Heidegger because it was. And Deleuze would never mention Heidegger, of course. They're incredibly influenced by him because of his bad political background. He's underneath all this. All I'm here is heavily influenced. I mean, most of French philosophy is heavily influenced by Heidegger. I mean,
He writes. He has a couple of books, doesn't he? Heidegger's written on the event
I mean, I haven't read
I got to go
so
to-
many of his later works. I think that's later. It's after being a time, I've read the stuff before.
Okay. Thank you.
The event, I mean, I think he was writing in the 1920s, and that's also just immediately after Einstein.
Yeah.
So Einstein, for the event and relativity is a very kind of significant thing. So there is this kind of thing between science but just in defense of Descartes, because I think you're right, Patrick, because Derrida's kind of comments about all kind of deconstruction of Descartes. There's this idea that there's this kind of ossified megalith, maybe, of Cartesian thought with the empowered at the center and at the controlling sort of space around it. But I actually think there is room for a much more kind of sympathetic and I think kind of radical rereading of Descartes, which is even maybe more radical than this notion that's been presented by these two Japanese philosophers, and no parents. He grew up in an orphanage. He served in combat. He saw people die. He was a Catholic, but he served for a Protestant army. He lived in exile because of his beliefs that were so contrary to his own kind of French society. He had one child, a 5-year-old daughter, who died at the age of 5, and then he became obsessed with kind of trying to make a kind of robot to kind of replicate her. He became very interested in robotics. But I think of so many philosophers, he was in many ways, I think, lived death to such an extent that kind of cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am, isn't, in my view, kind of coming out of a space of subjectivity. It's coming out actually of someone far more proximate to the idea of nothingness than many people who critique him I think it really is like a sort of a question mark at the end of that. Am I actually alive? How can I be alive if my parents are dead and I never knew them? Like, what am I? How can I be alive if people try to kill me? How can I be alive if I kill people? How can I be alive if my only child is dead? And I think it's like in that sort of really structured mantra almost, you can imagine kind of in the middle of the night, am I alive? Well, I'm thinking, so I must be alive. I think it's coming out of someone who's really sunk into the notion of nothingness that is being conceptually, cognitively conceived and presented as a concept by later philosophers. And I think that Descartes is incredible. And I mean, just his whole spectrum of work. And so I'm just saying that because sometimes Descartes can be sort of perceived as this sort of thing to be challenged, but I think it's just, there's a different way of thinking about it.
I think Descartes, sorry, I think the fact that Heidegger spends so much time talking about Descartes and Kant is not an accident. He only talks about people who he thinks are incredibly significant in the history of philosophy. So the fact that he spends a lot of time talking about Descartes, it's not because he doesn't think Descartes did an incredible thing. He just doesn't believe. He believes that there's something deeper than that. It's also true, right, that Husserl, who's one of the most important philosophers of the prior century, and was so important to Heidegger, really was a Cartesian, and got fully reading.
Cartesian Meditations.
Yeah, and that actually influenced quite like Heidegger heavily. So it's not so much a negative in a sense. It's just that Heidegger would say that you need to go deeper than that, and I think Kant, for example, would say you've gone too quickly, you've missed something as well, and so did Deleuze when I read him as well, and I think also Spinoza. So it's not that he's pivotal in science, but he did create this. He did the consequence of what he does in his idea, essentially of self-sufficient substance, which is the essence of what he's really getting at. He creates something that's self-supporting and could be this theoretical approach to looking at the world. This theoretical gaze, it comes from him. That's not necessarily a negative thing, but it's coming from Cartesian.
I thought, just thanks, Patrick. I think that's true. I think that maybe there are different ways of reading Descartes. But I also think it's kind of interesting. I was just sort of reflecting on the fact that this is, so just change the subject slightly. I'm kind of interested in anonymity. There's a group of mathematicians, the Bourbaki group of the early 1920s, who did all of this, what they thought to be radical maths, if people can imagine such a thing, revolutionary maths, and they published their work under a fictional name, Bourbaki, which is actually the name of a kind of a French general of the 19th century who sort of lost a terrible completely screwed up something. And they did that as a kind of radical kind of political gesture to the anonymity of their work, to sort of step back away from notions of kind of self and sort of educational, social prestige. It's kind of interesting that in this discussion of Sartre, Lacan, I think it was Nishita, excuse me if I got that wrong, Nishigani, maybe. We know their names, and their names are sort of noted. And there's an argument against subjectivity, and yet these individuals are being heralded in different ways. And Heidegger and Descartes, and we sort of reel off these names almost like sort of Old Testament prophets. And I don't know, I wonder if we really want to, and this is as an artist as well, as a creator, as a producer, if this is something kind of we want to embrace, should we be writing and creating art under the name of the Walpala and or another fabricated name, whatever it might be, and suppressing our own individual or creative authority, which is something that these writers and philosophers notably haven't done. I don't know. What do people think?
I think that's a great idea. I mean, I think it's a very interesting idea coming out of the way discussion's going. But the only thing I'd say is that supposing you wanted to follow the path of, say, Descartes or Heidegger or an individual's thinking around their existence a long time, that notion would get lost, and wouldn't there be a bit of chaos somehow? I don't know. I was just trying to, how, you know, in terms of the map of philosophy, would thinking become very sort of dispersed and fragmented to such a point that we wouldn't be able to kind of create patterns of thought along the lines of each individual, unless the individuals call themselves something like A, B, C, D, E, but no name attached.
I think there are two things I was thinking when you were bringing that up. One is, again, going back to Heidegger for 2 seconds, I think he had no interest in the lives of people. I think there was one lecture course where he introduced, somebody who's so important to his philosophy, Aristotle, and his description of Aristotle was, he was born this day and died this day, and then off he goes. He has, and that is actually the way I think his view of himself was, the way he wanted. He presented that it's not important at all who the person is. On the other hand, we can also think of what's it called? The book. I forgot the name of the philosopher. The Death of the Author. I mean, that's really about, you have no say once you publish. That's it, and that's true. That is true. There's a lot of truth in that. I don't know. Maybe not these days, but yes.
Roland Barthes, who read out The Death of the Author. I have this sort of kind of, his father clearly I'm obsessed, so apologies. His father was killed before he was born in the First World War. He died. He was sort of in the French Navy, and his ship was sunk, and he gone, no body found. And so Barthes kind of grew up with his own author dead, and tried to join the French army in the Second World War, but was refused on health grounds. But I sometimes think that there's an interesting way of reading that book, The Death of the Author, which does suggest this idea that you cannot be influenced, or that the reading of a book is your own reading, not the reading of the author. I think there's a way of kind of twisting it and seeing it in a completely different way, which is Barthes actually is heavily influenced by his own life, and he is representing the fact that he can not read his own life through the perspective of his father, his author, because his father died. And so actually there's a kind of tautological aspect of that book, which I feel has not been picked up, which is that depending on which way you approach it, if you approach it as someone who believes in the primacy of the reader, you have this kind of conventional reading, which is, it's not significant, the life of the author. it's the interpretation of the reader. But if you come at it from a different perspective, it actually proves the point that the life of the author is fundamental to the meaning, and it's that kind of it kind of proves the point that you arrive at it with, even though those 2 points may be completely contradictory theoretically, which I think is kind of really interesting about that particular book. But Heidegger, I mean, maybe, didn't, one might say, have an interest, have as, Aristotle went on the march with Alexander the Great. I mean, his entire family and his entire village were destroyed. Like, there's something kind of Aristotle's life. I can understand why Heidegger, who spent his life in the academy, might want to suggest that it wasn't fundamental to his way of thinking. But that's my view.
Just want to bring up, I mean, I hear what you're saying about Roland Barthes' father, and I didn't know that detail, but his book, Camera Lucida, was Roland Barthes' meditation on his mother's death. So that was also the other half of his authorship. So his mother was extremely important to him. So I just wanted to flag that up.
Obviously, it's an interesting book because it also marks the transition between structuralism and post-structuralism, and a sort of a movement away from an idea of a more scientific writing to a way which is more aesthetic and personal and effective. You could say with writing, it's these junctions which are important. It's not so much whether they're collective or individual, but the way it kind of creates in the field a set of conjunctions which
One thing when we were reading the text, I was thinking of this idea of writing and discourse, and the way he refers to language is very similar to Heidegger's idea that what is really fundamental is talk, and nothing. Not the symbols and talk. Talk is way beyond actual words. He talks of talking as being the only people who can. No, he talks of talk as being silence, as being speaking, as being things that are completely not to do with talk. I mean, his trying to get beneath the idea of where he's trying to get to the origin of language, if you like, is being. What is the being of language? And it's got nothing to do with the words or the symbols or any of that. That's, again, he's trying to scrape the surface in there, straight below the surface, and that's what's going on here.
I mean, it starts from the idea that language speaks. It's almost 8 o'clock. Shall we do this next week? Finish it off.
I think good idea.
And we could look over and come back to points and deepen some of the points. What do you think of it as a style of writing? A manner of writing? What's the thoughts? Is it good writing?
I think it's very easy to read and it's very clear. It's not poetical, not poetic.
I always feel when I read his text that he's imparting lots of information in a way that you want to absorb it. And it's very easy to give me lots of information I'm not interested. He's very good at touching the reader, maybe. I always find his text very interesting to read.
I spoke to him about his text, which I like a lot, and he disavowed it. He said he took it to a conference in Japan, and they attacked him as being Orientalist, and he took it to his heart and thought that he's not going to do anything with the text again.
That's really sad.
Yeah, I said I disagree that it's Orientalist. It's
I don't think I didn't read it as Orientalist, so I don't know what other people think.
I guess Orientalist in the context of Zen and emptiness and what was the term Sutayama or along those lines, which is I think a Zen concept.
Vignetta.
So yeah.
But it's not objectifying those ideas. It's just engaging with them, surely.
Yeah, but I mean, but using them in the sense that rather than Cartesian, where you're separate and distinct from the world, in his view, you're embedded in it, which is, I think, very much Zen. So I could see why somebody would say he comes from a Zen perspective, even though I don't think he thought that himself.
Right. Yes.
I like the way he said quite early on, I will try to be as clear as I can. Rather than just being clear, he's letting us know there's something kind of, maybe that's the touching aspect that you mentioned, Jonathan, there's something kind of conversational.
Yes, and he is very clear. He sort of lives up to his promise.
He's a
I
brilliant.
feel, sorry. I feel like the title of Orientalist is like just from others, and with different people there will be different meanings.
I'll tell you another funny story about him. Someone went to the library in America. I forget which university it was. One of the East Coast universities, and they had in books. There was a little bit of paper chewed, like a little fraction of the book was chewed. And apparently he had this habit of when he liked a book, he would eat a little bit of it, like a bit of medicine or a little trace.
Is it a psychological like habit? That's
So you don't just have to read a book, you have to taste it.
You're never afraid of being toxic by the books being like put there for 100 years.
I mean, it might be one of his myths.
But I can see that there are like so many contents that he puts inside just one text. And like as for me, I didn't read as much as this much. So during the reading, I am thinking of if there is like a hyperlink for me to search, then that would be a lot better. So during reading, I'm like searching all those words and the people about their thinking, so I can have the context to read.
I've just seen a sentence: fire can burn everything that can be burned, but one thing fire cannot burn is fire. For fire to be fire, it must extend out of the self-enclosure of the flame into the surrounding field, and only when its roots travel into the surrounding can it burn. That's brilliant. Anyway, we meet next week.